I got a brand new sweetie, better than the one before. Oh, she's got everything and a little bit more.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the first ever episode of my new podcast, Additional History, Headlines You Probably Missed. I'm your host, Tiffany Clark, and this is the podcast where I look at newspaper headlines and stories from major events in our nation's history. And then I ignore those headlines and stories and find out what else was happening across the country on the exact same day. You see, I'm a person that easily falls down rabbit holes when I'm reading about something, and this podcast is a way to share some of the stuff I pull out of those holes with you. If you have more information about any of the stories I share, or if you want to make a suggestion on an event for me to cover, please let me know. I've got dozens of ideas for episodes, but that doesn't mean I can't use more. Each episode will contain 3 additional history stories and a fun look at some of the advertisements in the newspapers of that day. So, without further ado, let's get to the good stuff. Today's famous headline comes from a day that just celebrated its 50th anniversary 1 year ago today. I figured since this was the exact day it happened 51 years ago, I should start with this event. I would bet anyone that lived through that day could tell you exactly what they were doing when they heard the news. For today's event, I pulled a headline from the Tampa Tribune out of Tampa, Florida, from July 21st, 1969. In giant, bold letters on the front page of the paper, the headline yells, "Man on the Moon." The day before, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to ever set foot on the moon. The 1960s had many big headlines about space travel, starting when the USSR beat the United States and put the first man, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. From then on, it became a race to be the first country to put a man on the moon. As a side note right here, Yuri Gagarin was killed in 1968 when the MiG he was piloting crashed, so he wasn't even around to witness the historic moonwalk. Kinda sad. Anyway, the USSR made multiple attempts to get to the moon, and it's believed they made an attempt just days before NASA's Apollo 11 landed successfully. But it was the USA's turn to be victorious. Armstrong and Aldrin did something that day that only 10 other humans have done, ever. Although 7 countries were able to eventually put spacecraft into orbit around the moon, the USA is still the only country who has ever set foot there, and no one has been back since 1972. As amazing and awesome as the first lunar landing was, it wasn't the only thing of importance that happened that day. You can read books and watch movies and documentaries about the moon landing, but in order to find out what else was going on around the world on July 21st, 1969, you're going to have to check out the newspapers. For my first story today, I'm going to tell you about someone who made headlines on July 21st, 1969 by doing something at the same time man was walking on the moon for the first time. That man was Major Stephen W. Pless. Before I tell you what the headline said about Stephen, I'm going to tell you a little bit about his background. Stephen was born in 1939 in Georgia. He graduated from the Georgia Military Academy in 1957 and then went on to train in other areas. Eventually, he graduated from flight training in 1960 and then became a naval aviator. In the early 60s, Stephen was stationed in Thailand and Vietnam before returning to the U.S. and becoming a flight instructor at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. But, as you know, that was a time of major unrest in Vietnam, and he eventually returned to serve there again. It was during this second deployment to Vietnam that Stephen proved to be a real hero. On the 19th of August, 1967, Stephen heard an emergency call come in. 4 American soldiers were trapped on a beach and were being attacked by an overwhelming number of Viet Cong soldiers. Stephen immediately jumped into action and flew his Huey helicopter close to the scene. As he approached, he could see the enemy attacking, and he immediately began firing upon them. He was so close to the ground that his helicopter was being hit by debris thrown up from his own rockets. Now, it was about this time that Major Pless noticed one of the American soldiers he'd flown in to save waving in his direction, trying desperately to get the pilot's attention. Stephen landed his helicopter between the enemy and the wounded soldiers so his crew could leave the aircraft and help the soldiers to safety. While the helicopter was on the ground, the enemy continued to fire while inching closer and closer and closer to the chopper. They came within a few feet of the helicopter. Now, I don't know how he did it, but somehow Stephen managed to stay calm and keep control of the machine. As soon as the wounded men were on board, he took off over the sea. But there was a problem. The helicopter was so weighed down with the extra people, it came back down and touched the water 4 different times before Stephen managed to get it airborne. He saved the lives of 3 men and his crew that day. Now, friends, as you can imagine, Stephen Pless received many awards because of his bravery and service. And on January 16th, 1969, he was awarded the highest honor someone in the military can receive. He was given the Medal of Honor by outgoing President Lyndon B. Johnson. For months after he received the award, Major Pless made headlines all over the South as he traveled and was honored by all kinds of places and organizations. Everyone wanted to see and hear from their hero. So, now that I've caught you up on Stephen's background, we're brought to the reason why he made headlines again on July 21st, 1969, just 6 short months after receiving the Medal of Honor. This headline comes from the Tampa Tribune out of Florida and reads, "Hero Killed in Bridge Plunge." Yes, the 29-year-old man who survived more than a decade in the military, the man who survived nearly 800 combat missions in Vietnam, the man who seemed invincible, had died, and it was in a stupid accident. According to the article, Stephen was riding his motorcycle when a drawbridge over the Santa Rosa Sound near Pensacola opened up to let barge traffic cross through. Stephen wasn't able to stop in time, lost control of his motorcycle, and fell over the edge of the open drawbridge. Divers searched the water, but it took 7 hours to find his body. Stephen left behind his wife Joanne, a 6-year-old son Paul, 4-year-old daughter Tina, and 2-year-old daughter Cynthia. Joanne was pregnant with their 4th child when Stephen died. In 1985, 16 years after the accident, the military named a ship after Stephen, and it's still in use today. And on top of that, if you ever make it to the United States Marine Corps Museum near Quantico, Virginia, you can see the actual Huey helicopter that Major Pless flew during his daring rescue on display there. Or, if you can't make it to Virginia, you can go to the museum's Facebook page or YouTube and watch a short video that gives even more detail about Stephen Pless's bravery. I'll put a link to that on the Additional History Facebook group if you want to check it out. For my next story, I'm going to talk about an article that was printed in the Boston Globe on July 21st, 1969. This story is about an event that had actually happened a couple nights earlier, but with all the excitement over Apollo 11 launching and then the moon landing, it didn't make it into some of the papers until the 21st, and in other newspapers, it was still being reported again and again and again. There are articles about this event in literally hundreds of newspapers from that day, and before the interest in the event would die off, literally thousands of articles would be written. Now, friends, one thing I want to make very clear is that I don't want this podcast to be political. After all, I started this podcast because I truly love history and I love telling stories. It's meant to be a fun escape for you, my listeners, for a few minutes each week. That being said, sometimes the events I share might involve politics. I'll do my best to share both sides of the story and try to stick to proven facts. If something is a theory or rumor only, I'll make sure I make note of that. The story I'm about to tell you has been controversial from day one. But it was a huge event that is still talked about today, even though 50 years have passed. In 2018, a movie was made about this incident, even though all the main characters have passed away. Because of the story's notoriety, I feel like I can't cover July 21st of 1969 without telling this story. This headline from the Boston Globe reads, "Kennedy faces court hearing July 28th. Yes, friends, this was the event that Senator Ted Kennedy could never get away from. It was the event that many say is the reason he never became president. At the same time man was walking on the moon for the first time in world history, the Kennedy family was experiencing yet another tragedy. You might know it by the name the Chappaquiddick incident, or just the name of the movie, Chappaquiddick. The Kennedy family consisted of Joseph Sr. and his wife Rose and their 9 children. Joseph was a businessman who had his hands in multiple ventures. During the Great Depression, he was making money rather than losing it, and by the mid-1930s, he had so much wealth he would have had over $3 billion by today's standard. Because of this, those 9 children grew up with a lot of opportunity. Sadly, the Kennedy family was also well known not just for their involvement in politics, but for the tragedies and curses they couldn't seem to shake. First, the oldest daughter, Rosemary, ended up in a mental facility after a failed lobotomy in 1941. That is a whole story in and of itself. Then, the oldest son, Joseph Jr., died while piloting an airplane in 1944 during World War II. Next, the second daughter, Kathleen, died in an airplane crash in 1948. In 1963, then-President John F. Kennedy lost his infant son, who was born prematurely and only lived for a couple of days. While his family still mourned, he was assassinated just 3 months later. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated during his campaign to be president. Now, if history had been just a little bit different, Edward Kennedy, who preferred to go by Ted or Teddy, wouldn't even have been alive himself in 1969. 5 years earlier, Ted was in a plane crash too. The pilot and another passenger died, but somehow Ted managed to escape with his life. He had a broken back and had to stay in the hospital for months, but eventually he was able to return to his old life and back to politics. By 1969, he was the only remaining Kennedy son. So, when the incident of July 1969 happened, it tore the beleaguered family down. For those who don't know, Chappaquiddick is part of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. Now, although I've been to the Massachusetts coast, I've never been to Martha's Vineyard. Without having actually gone there, I always pictured it as one town. In reality, Martha's Vineyard is made up of 6 towns. Our story takes place on Chappaquiddick, which is an island that's part of one of those 6 towns called Edgartown. The night of July 18th, 1969, Ted attended a party on Chappaquiddick. There were 6 men and 6 women in attendance. The women had all worked on Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign, and the party was a reunion of sorts for them. One of those women was named Mary Jo Chappaquiddick. Mary Jo was born in Pennsylvania and then grew up in New Jersey. She went to an all-girls Catholic school and then attended a women's college. Mary Jo was civic-minded and loved to be involved in community and politics. After teaching for a while in Alabama, she moved to Washington, D.C. to be the secretary for Senator George Smathers. Then, when Robert F. Kennedy was elected in 1964, she joined his team. Mary Jo was described as hardworking and dedicated. She helped write speeches for Robert Kennedy and once stayed up all night helping the senator and his team write a speech about the Vietnam War. So after an entire year had passed since Robert's assassination, 28-year-old Mary Jo was excited to reunite with old friends in Chappaquiddick. This is where things in the story start to get a little murky. Some sources say Mary Jo started feeling sick as the night wore on and asked Ted to drive her back to the ferry that goes to Edgartown so she could get to her hotel. Other sources say she left her purse at the party, so she must have been planning to come back. Since everyone involved that night is gone, this is something we'll probably never know. Anyway, we do know that at some point, Ted and Mary Jo left the party together in his car. Although Ted should have been familiar with the island, he took a wrong turn, or else turned wrong on purpose, at a fork in the road, and ended up on the opposite side of the island from the ferry. That wrong turn proved to be the biggest mistake of his life. As the pair continued to drive, they approached a narrow wooden bridge. Ted lost control of the car while going over the bridge, and they drove over the edge. The car landed upside down in the water. Somehow, Ted wasn't overly injured, and he managed to get himself out of the car. Now, friends, this is another area of the story that gets murky. Some sources say Ted dove back into the water multiple times, hoping to find Mary Jo, but he wasn't successful. Others say he just left the scene without trying to help her. Some sources say he swam across the island and returned to his hotel room in Edgerton without going anywhere else. Other sources say he went back to the party and got 2 of the guys to come and help him look for Mary Jo in the water. The one thing we do know for sure is the one thing that was the breaking point for Ted's reputation. Neither Ted, nor anyone else for that matter, reported the crash for 10 hours. Yes, you heard that right. He waited 10 hours to report what happened. Some think it was because he was drunk and wanted to sober up first, but Ted claims he had a concussion and was in shock and didn't know what he was doing, and it wasn't until the next morning that his head cleared enough to remember the event of the night before. So many theories came out about what happened that night that Ted's team had to work overtime to put out the fires and calm the rumors. Some said Ted and Mary Jo were having an affair and she was pregnant, so he purposely drove into the water. Considering the fact that an autopsy was never performed on Mary Jo, that theory doesn't seem very probable to me. Most sources believe that Mary Jo did survive the wreck, but suffocated when she ran out of air. But again, that was never proved. Like I said, there are so many theories and varied versions of what happened that night that your head will be swimming with conflicting information if you read all of them. I would like to point out here that in most of the newspaper articles I read, Mary Jo was referred to as an attractive blonde or a pretty woman, and maybe her name would be included. It's sad that someone who had accomplished so much at such a young age was only remembered for her looks. Anyway, as far as Ted goes, he decided not to run for president in 1972, and then again in 1976 because of the Chappaquiddick incident. He eventually ran in 1980 but didn't get the Democratic nomination. For his part in the incident, Ted was charged with leaving the scene of an accident and sentenced to 2-month suspended jail sentence, and he got his license taken away for 16 months. Senator Kennedy served in the U.S. Senate for almost 47 years before he died of brain cancer in August of 2009. For my last story today, I'm going to share with you something that comes from the Alexandria Daily Town Talk out of Louisiana. That paper covered the moon landing, of course, but there was another small article that caught my attention. It told a story I'd never heard before about someone I've never heard of either. So why did this seemingly insignificant article catch my attention? Because this person has a very famous brother, and it surprised me that I didn't know of his existence. This headline reads, "Brother of Murdered Rights Leader Found Dead in Pool." On July 21st, 1969, Albert Daniel King, the younger brother of Martin Luther King Jr., was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool after he'd gone for an evening swim. Somehow, until I read that article, I didn't know that Martin Luther King Jr. had a brother who was a civil rights activist like himself. Albert, or A.D. as everyone called him, was born just a couple of years after Martin. He married Naomi Ruth Barber when he was just 19 and she was only 17. They started a family and eventually had 5 kids. Now, A.D. was a preacher just like his famous brother and father. He was even arrested multiple times in Birmingham for his role in civil rights activities. At one point, his house was bombed, but luckily nobody was injured. When Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis the year before, A.D. had been right there with him. Now, quite often younger siblings with famous older siblings resent the fact that they live in the shadows and lack attention. But that's not how A.D. was. He was content with his role in helping and assisting his brother. When Martin was killed, A.D. took over for him as one of the preachers at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and he also took a more active role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, although he didn't try to take on the head role. I guess it's only fitting that A.D.'s death fell in the shadow of one of the greatest moments of humankind. On that fateful night in July of 1969, 3 of A.D.'s children were home with him, but his wife Naomi and the other 2 children were vacationing in Jamaica or Nassau, depending on which source you read, with Martin's widow Coretta. The 3 kids at home had fallen asleep, and nobody knew their father had drowned until they found him in the pool the next morning. So, how does a seemingly healthy 38-year-old man manage to drown in his own backyard pool? That was the question that A.D.'s family wanted answered. The police never investigated the incident as a murder, but the King family believed that could have been what happened. They pointed out that A.D. didn't have water in his lungs, meaning he was dead before he hit the water, and according to his wife, he had bruising and marks around his neck. That all sounds pretty convincing to me, but it wasn't the only story that people believed. Others that were close to A.D. said the drowning was an accident and he probably had a heart attack while swimming. 3 of A.D.'s children ended up having heart attacks at very young ages. His daughter was only 20 when she died of a heart attack in 1976. We'll never know all the details of that night, but at least now, for those of us who didn't know, Martin Luther King Jr. once had a brother named Albert Daniel, and he too worked hard for the right of others. Okay, friends, there was a lot of big stuff in the newspapers on July 21st, 1969. One of the fun things that can be found in old newspapers are old advertisements. So, to lighten it up a little bit, I'm going to end each episode of this podcast with an advertisement I found in one of the newspapers of the day. For today's advertisement, I looked at an ad for Kentucky Fried Chicken in the Town Talk. The ad was for KFC's Chicken Dinner Box. The box included 3 pieces of chicken, coleslaw, mashed potatoes and gravy, and a hot biscuit. That should have been enough to fill anybody up. You could get all of that food for the whopping price of 97 cents. Oh, the good old days. Friends, thanks for joining me for the first ever episode of this podcast. I hope you enjoyed the stories as much as I did. Join me next week for more fun stories on additional history, headlines you probably missed.